born in 1950, so in 1968, when the student revolution began, I was 18 years old and I got interested in economics. Of course, I read Karl Marx like everybody else then. And this interest in economics has always stayed with me for 40 years. I've worked in different jobs. I've been a scriptwriter, I've been a teacher, but this interest has always stayed with me. And then about 10 years or 8 years ago, I found out that there was no book on the history of the IMF. And I always thought that the IMF was a very important organization. So I started to do some research in this and I decided to write a book on the IMF. I never knew that it would be that difficult because the material was just so abundant. But the outcome was actually the book, and actually it kind of made me feel that my suspicion that the IMF was a very rotten organization was absolutely true. The origin of the IMF dates back to the Conference of Bretton Woods. From our point of view nowadays, the Conference of Bretton Woods has to be seen as the most important conference of the 20th century. Because the results of the Conference of Bretton Woods affect the lives of more than 7 billion people in this world today. The Conference of Bretton Woods in 1944 took place in a very special historical situation. The British Empire had come to an end and a new superpower had emerged, the United States. The United States was had the biggest industry at that time. Every second commodity or every second good that was produced in 1944 was produced in the United States. They held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves and they had the strongest army. They were the only nation that had the atomic bomb at that time. So they were the #1 superpower, but they had one problem. They needed markets. Their industry produced more goods than their own market could absorb. So they had to look for new markets. And in order to conquer these new markets, they established the system of Bretton Woods, which did something that had never existed in the world before. They made their own currency the lead currency of the world. They made the dollar the world's lead currency. The dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and every other currency in the world was pegged to the dollar. So that established the domination of the dollar that exists until this day. The idea of the IMF was conceived at the Conference of Bretton Woods, and the IMF was actually founded 1 or 2 years later. And its task was to oversee the implementation of the new world global financial system. That is the role of the US dollar as the lead currency. And that's what the IMF actually did in the 1940s and in the 1950s. It became sort of a watchdog for the implementation of the US dollar as the world's lead currency. And then in the 1960s, the role of the IMF actually changed. In the 1960s, a lot of African countries became independent. And these countries, of course, had fought for their independence. And most of the new governments were kind of left-wing governments that had strong ties to the Soviet Union. So in order to find their place in the world markets, these countries needed money. And they had to take out loans, but the Western banks were not willing to give them loans. So that's when the IMF stepped in as the lender of last resort. The IMF stepped in and gave out loans to these countries, but they gave them out at very harsh conditions. And that's where conditionality, which is one of the most important aspects of IMF lending, where that has its origin. That is, the IMF gave out loans to African countries under the condition that they would cut back their spending, that they would cut back expenses for education, for health care, for old age pensions, and that they would implement certain people in the jobs of the central bankers, for example. So they exercised a lot of influence on these countries, and they took away a part of these countries' sovereignty. I can tell you exactly how it affects that, because in the late 70s, the IMF set up its structural adjustment programs. And there are 4 pillars to these structural adjustment programs: that stabilization, deregulation, privatization, and liberalization. And take, for example, liberalization. Liberalization means that the flow of commodities and capital should be liberalized. That is, these countries should open up their markets for big companies from the US and from Europe. But as soon as you open up these markets, you know, these big companies become competitors to the small farmers in these countries, so the small farmers cannot survive. It is impossible for a small farmer who raises like about 500 chickens to compete with an American food company. It's absolutely impossible. So liberalization has had a really dreadful effect on these small farmers. They all lost their basis for their livelihood. That's one thing. Deregulation means that the small banks in these countries were kicked out of business, and the big banks of the United States and Europe took over. Then privatization means that these countries, in order to pay back their loans, had to privatize all their public utilities. That is, like the water supply, the electricity supply, and so on, went to Western companies. And that meant that prices went up, so people had to pay more. Some people couldn't pay for water anymore, so their right, the human right to access water was taken away from them. And the consequence was that a lot of people actually died of hunger and starvation. Labor flexibility sounds very good at the surface, but what does it mean? It means that somebody who works for 8 hours a day has to be able to work for 24 hours a day, because if his employer calls him and tells him you can work for 4 hours a day, but we need you to work for 4 hours tomorrow night, he has to do that. That is the meaning of flexibility. I mean, George Orwell was a very wise man, and doublespeak is one of the most important aspects of the IMF. Those rescue packages were no rescue packages. Those were loans for which those countries have to pay interest. So that doesn't have anything to do with a rescue package, because to me a rescue package would be giving them money in order to survive and not demanding any interest on this money. So doublespeak is like a very, very important thing, and all the leaders of the IMF, which are all corrupt people, are very good at doublespeak. I mean, just take a look at the last three leaders of the IMF. They're all very corrupt people. It's Rodrigo Rato, it's Dominique Strauss-Kahn, and it's Christine Lagarde. And all three of them are facing trials because of embezzlement and fraud. So, I mean, the head of this organization kind of represents its ethics and its morals, which are absolutely non-existent.